Hello everyone! In this video I will show you how to build the Ragnarok step by step. The Ragnarok is a hull developed by me and you, the MJet community, who did massive amount of work by testing all different versions of the Ragnarok during the development. Thank you! The Ragnarok hull files are free for everyone. You can go right now, click the link in the description and download all STL files and even step files for the Ragnarok hull. To power the Ragnarok, you can choose one of the compatible MJet pumps. Currently, the Ragnarok is compatible with the MJet 35 and with the MJet 30. I will also include links to these pumps in the description, as well as some more information about these pumps, because this video is focused on the Ragnarok itself. In this video, I will show you how to build the Ragnarok using the MJet 35. However, the process when building the Ragnarok using the MJet 30 is very similar. The version of the Ragnarok which I am building in this video is the V11, which is the newest to date of shooting this video. If you are building the Ragnarok later, there might be some updates and you might find that some parts look a bit differently. However, the key idea and general procedure of the assembly will stay the same. Let me also briefly talk about self-righting. The Ragnarok comes in two versions. One of them has the flat chamber, which is this hole in the back, and this makes the boat self-right. When the boat flips over, the flat chamber fills with water, it makes that side heavier, and it flips the boat back.
To je hodně rychlý.
The reliability of the self-righting depends a little bit on which battery and which electronics you choose, because that changes the CG of the hull, but generally it should be possible to make the Ragnarok self-right. Then there is the other version which doesn't have the flat chamber, and that version has all other advantages. Apart from that, it doesn't self-right. So if your boat flips over in the middle of the lake, you will have to find different ways to get it. Before we start the build, I would also like to point you to some more helpful resources about how to build the Ragnarok. For example, the part list and the manual. Both the part list and the manual are a part of the Ragnarok file package, which is for free and available in the description. The manual covers information, for example, about print settings and some more. Maybe the most useful help for the assembly itself are the Ragnarok drawings, which you can also find in the files. I recommend that you print those, because they show positions of all fasteners and they also guide you through the process. Alright, now the fun part. We won't be building just any Ragnarok. I will show you how to build a high-end Ragnarok, using some of the most powerful electronics the MJet 35 can use. Here I need to make a few points about electronics. First of all, the electronics need to be selected based on which pump you choose, either the MJet 35 or the MJet 30. The guidelines for choosing electronics for these pumps is in the manuals for these pumps. I am attaching the manual for the MJet 30 and for the MJet 35 in the description. All jet pumps in general, and especially the MJet 35 being currently the most powerful MJet pump from the main branch, are very sensitive and very demanding in terms of electronics and how you select the motor kV, for example. The values for the recommended motor kVs and the ESC ratings are covered in the motor kV charts for the MJet 30 and the MJet 35. The motor kV charts are based on real-life measurements and they represent my suggestions about how to build a setup which produces great amount of power while staying efficient, cool, safe, and while maintaining reasonable power consumption. Speaking of a high-power Ragnarok, by far the best way is to just use 6S or 8S if your ESC is capable of that. Any lower amount of cells, such as 4S or even 3S, would result in much higher amount of amps in order to reach the same power output. In order to keep the amps reasonably low, which in this case means staying at least under 200 amps, we need to increase the voltage, and therefore we need to choose the 6S setup in order to reach a high-performing Ragnarok. When building a Ragnarok with the MJet 35 and using the biggest possible motor, which means 40 class, 40 mm in diameter, I definitely do not suggest using less than 6S if you want to reach the full potential. For more context about how the motor KV works, I am attaching a video about motor KV in the description. So for my Ragnarok, I chose to use a 4092 1400 kV motor powered by 6S 4000 mAh battery, and for the ESC I chose to use the Castle Creations Hydra X. Out of these components, the ESCs, based on various feedback from the MJet community, seem to be the critical point in terms of price versus performance. Just from what I saw in the MJet community, cheap electric motors don't seem to have problems. Cheap batteries also sometimes work, but cheap ESCs can generate a ton of problems. In the worst cases they can explode. Therefore, for the ESC, it seems to be preferable to choose a brand you know you can somehow trust. For example, I saw some good feedback about the Hobbywing 180 amps and some Spectrum ESCs. I am not sponsored, I am just giving an honest recommendation. That's it for the intro, let's get started with the build. Before we start the Ragnarok assembly, I would like to talk a little bit about the printing orientation of these three parts: the hull rear, hull middle, and hull front. First of all, this printing orientation doesn't require any supports on any of these parts. The hull front printed on the nose might be a little bit challenging. This part definitely requires a brim down here to keep it on the build plate, but it has advantages which I will show just in a minute. So the second purpose of choosing this printing orientation is to fight warping. Even if you have perfect print settings, with some materials it might just happen that the prints warp. And what happens is that only the surfaces which are lying on the build plate might deform. The top surfaces are straight. So the advantage of printing like this is that when you start the assembly, you glue the hull middle like this. And both of these surfaces are flat. So this joint is okay. And then there is the front joint, which is more complicated. Because as the hull middle is lying like this on the build plate, it might just happen that this surface warps. And now if the hull front is flat, then you could see a gap right here and right here. This was a common problem with the previous versions of the Ragnarok. But now this new version has a little trick, and the trick is that you can choose a version of the hull front which has compensation for the warping of the hull middle. What I did was I took the hull front and I transformed the STL to bend the corners like this. This is the base layer, one more layer, second one, third one, fourth one, and tiny fifth one. So this compensates for a 1 mm gap in the corner. There are multiple versions of hull front. The basic one doesn't have any compensation like this and the surface here is flat. But if your hull middle warps, so what you do is you lay it against a flat surface and you measure it down there. And you measure the distance to the warped corner. For me it's like 1 mm. And then you print hull front with 1 mm warping compensation. And there we go. There is no gap. So that's it about the printing orientation, and now let's start the build. I will start by cutting the flotation templates from the paper sheets. The flotation is a safety feature in case of an unexpected accident, such as if the boat ends up in the middle of the lake and has no power. The flotation will help to prevent the boat from sinking completely, even if there is a tiny leakage into the hull. The flotation is optional, but I highly recommend doing this. To cut the flotation, I am using a 28 mm foam polystyrene sheet, which is commonly used for isolating buildings. You can also use any different foam, it just has to be light and it shouldn't absorb water. Some people use expanding foam in the nose instead of this rather complicated method. I just find that there is a risk that the expanding foam will absorb water and that it could expand too much and damage the front hull. Proceed by test fitting the pieces of flotation into the hull. The pieces will very likely require some further trimming, but that's okay. By the way, I already glued the hull, but it's better to do the flotation first. After you test all the flotation pieces, remove the flotation again to be able to apply clear coat on the inside of the hull. Let's start by installing the prepared MJ35 housing into the hull rear. The steps to prepare the MJ35 housing are described in the MJ35 full build video, so please follow this one to see how to prepare the housing. I will link the video in the description. I also already installed the seals, both of the seals and the main bearing. You might need to sand the hull rear a little bit depending on your printing tolerances, so let's do that. Yeah, now this is a perfect fit. Now, before applying any glue onto the MJ35 housing, I suggest that you use paper tape to cover all the important places, such as all threads, the water cooling pipes, most importantly the seals, and also this area here. Remember to cover the seal from the inside, using a circle from a paper tape. Now it's the time for epoxy. I'm using 5 minutes again, you can use a longer one. Alright, now just take the housing and slide it into the hull. Alright, and of course glue will start flowing everywhere. Use some weight to keep the pump housing in place while the glue is curing. You will have to shim the hull rear with a plank of wood. So the first batch of epoxy on the pump has cured, but I will reinforce it from the inside. Now that I also did this part, all glue is there, so I can now clean this slot for the steering shaft. So I successfully cleaned the hole for the steering shaft, and as you can see, the seal is untouched, which is a success. Now let's assemble the hull front and the hull middle together. I find it's easier to do the front joint first, because in the process you need to access these screws inside, and if you do this joint first, you can easily access them even with an electronic screwdriver. I recommend that you start by pre-tapping the threads. Also remember that all of these have an angle, so don't try to screw the screw in straight. The front joint gets reinforced by using one M3x30 and 5 M3x8 with a flat head. Just be careful to not over-tighten these screws, as they get threaded directly into plastic, which might strip out quite easily. Before gluing the rear part of the hull, this is now the good time to insert two screws which will hold the battery, two M3x40. Let's move on to finally gluing all this together, like this. And I will once again start by pre-drilling these holes. The rear joint gets also reinforced by 5 M3x8 with a flat head. I am using a regular Allen key to operate with the screws. Yeah, looks okay. The next part is to glue the lid base into place, like this. I will start by taping off some of the areas once again, because I don't want any glue on this part. And I will tape off the housing completely. This will require quite a lot of glue. Here I am using a 5-minute epoxy and I had to rush a little bit. If you like to work comfortably slowly, I recommend using 10 minutes or more. The glue gets applied onto the hull itself, and then the lid base can just slide into place. To secure it in place while the glue is curing, I am using pieces of paper tape. The front bumper can either be printed in the same material as the hull or in TPU. I chose the same ASA as I chose for the hull, because I want to carbon wrap the hull from the bottom, as you will see in a minute. To highly increase the durability of the hull, as well as completely eliminating the possibility of any layer separation in the bottom part of the hull caused by weak layer adhesion in the print, I chose to wrap the bottom hull in carbon fiber. You can also totally use fiberglass, the benefits will be the same. Or you can totally skip this step, there are many people driving the Ragnarok without any carbon wrap. Here I am masking any parts of the hull where I don't want any drips of epoxy. I find it absolutely necessary to cover the pump, but actually I would recommend masking the upper hull too. Notice that this process will unavoidably block the holes which lead into the flat chamber, and we will have to re-drill those later. Ah, nice. I am using a twill carbon fiber fabric, 160 grams per meter squared. Applying just one layer of this is completely sufficient. Before mixing any epoxy resin, trim the carbon fabric to fit the shape of your hull. Also cut away the part which would cover the intake of the pump. Now it's the time to mix the epoxy resin. I think I am using a 90-minute epoxy here, but I think this would be doable with a 30-minute epoxy. I mixed 100 grams of the epoxy resin in total, and it was more than enough. First I am applying the epoxy resin uniformly on the bottom hull. As soon as you start placing the carbon fiber fabric on the hull, it will become kind of sticked to the epoxy resin, so just count with this and try to align it from the start, as nicely as possible. Then I am applying more resin from the top to soak through the carbon fiber. You don't have to overdo this, you don't want to add unnecessary weight to the hull. After the resin has cured, I am sanding the rough edges. It would be also great to sand the whole bottom of the hull to possibly reduce drag. And now, don't forget to drill the holes into the flood chamber, which got blocked by the carbon fiber. Ideally, the holes should be just next to the flood chamber wall, as shown in the second picture. This will make sure that all air can escape from the flood chamber and the boat will self-right. The spray paint has two purposes. One is visual, obviously, and the second purpose is to seal the 3D print. By the nature of 3D printing, sometimes there might be little gaps in the print, in random places. If you don't seal those, water might find its way through the hull. I don't want to paint the carbon fiber, so I am masking it. I also don't want any color in the inside, so I'm attaching the TPU lid and masking it as well. After the main color is applied, I also suggest that you remove the TPU lid now and apply a clear coat both from the inside and the outside. Also spray some clear coat into the flood chamber. This all helps to seal the hull. Now it's time for those little things we have missed so far. First, attach two M5x20 grub screws into their positions. This will later hold the rollcage frame. They are not meant to be unscrewed later, so I am securing them with epoxy. The rear wing gets mounted using two M2x10 and two M3x14. Now let's push in the threaded inserts using a soldering iron. These will hold the turn fins. There are 8 of them to hold the turn fins, and you can also use additional 4 of them in the back to hold the trim tabs, but I won't be using trim tabs for now, so I am skipping those. Here I am also attaching the turn fins using 4 M3x6, but it is actually better to do this only after the complete build is finished, otherwise you risk breaking the turn fins during the assembly as I did. Because the clear coat is already applied from the inside, now we can insert the flotation permanently. Let's assemble the roll cage. The roll cage rear and the roll cage front, together with the roll cage triangle, get attached using 3 M3x30. Then the roll cage base gets mounted to the rest of the roll cage by using 4 M3x30. Then there is one additional M3x10 in the bottom, which connects the roll cage base to the roll cage triangle. And finally, the roll cage gets attached to the frame bars by using 4 M3x10. You can see the exact positions of all screws in the drawing I showed in the beginning of the video. Lastly, the frame bar engine gets attached to the left and right frame bars using 4 M3x10. Let's proceed with the engine. I decided to paint the engine block in gold, as well as part of the turbocharger. The rest will be silver. The engine block and the intake manifold get glued using epoxy. This is the only part which gets glued. The rest of the engine gets assembled using screws. I am using paper tape to hold the engine together while the glue is curing. After the glue is cured, let's assemble the full engine. 2 parts of the intercooler get joined using 2 M2x6. Next, the turbo exhaust and turbo middle get joined using 1 M2x10. Pay attention to the correct orientation of the turbo middle relative to the exhaust. Next, the turbo intake gets attached using two M2x6. Once again, make sure that this is properly oriented. The exhaust manifold gets attached to the engine block using four M2x6. The turbo gets connected to the exhaust manifold using one M2x10. Next, the intercooler gets connected to the turbo using one M2x10. Finally, the intercooler gets attached to the exhaust manifold using three M2x6. This is the full engine assembly. Let's proceed with working on the pilots. The pilots' heads get attached to the bodies using epoxy. Notice that the heads are slightly different. The correct head results in better alignment with the body. Next, the bodies get attached to the seats using two M3x10. Due to one mounting hole in the top part of the seat, these two seats are different. Make sure that you are using the driver's seat for the driver and navigator's seat for the navigator. This is shown in the drawing. With the pilots and the engine done, let's mount them onto the rollcage frame. The engine gets mounted to the rollcage frame using four M3x10. Then the turbocharger is supported using one more M3x10. Let's proceed with mounting the pilots. They get mounted using two M3x8. And on the top, they are supported by two M2x10. And that's it, we have the whole rollcage frame finished. To hold the rollcage frame on the hull, print your favorite version of the locking knobs and insert two M5 nuts into them. I am attaching a sticky velcro to hold the battery. I will also connect a velcro loop which will secure the battery in place using these two M3x40 screws. Then, before you have the whole hull full of electronics, install the water cooling pipes, connect them to the inlet and the outlet, and secure them with zip ties. I am also attaching a sticky velcro to the ESC to hold the ESC in place. I will mount the ESC right next to the motor. When installing the motor, make sure that it is properly centered and that the motor can doesn't interfere with the hull anywhere, and also that it doesn't get pushed off center by the ESC. Then, connect the water cooling. It doesn't really matter if you connect it first to the motor or the ESC, because there are valid arguments for both systems, the ESC first or the motor first. Don't forget to apply sticky velcro on the battery as well. And check that all electronics hold in place reliably. Connect the receiver. For the receiver, I'm using a drybox, which keeps it dry. In order to see how to build the drybox, which we didn't go through in this video, I am attaching a link to the Super Sprint video, where I am also showing how to assemble the drybox for the receiver. So here it is in detail, how I managed to place the electronics in the Ragnarok. So we have the water cooling inlet, which is the right one from this side. It's going into the motor, then from the motor into the ESC, and from the ESC into the outlet, which is the left side. Remember to put a zip tie on every single nipple, because there were also cases when the water cooling nipples just flew off and filled the hull. Like this. And let me pour this out. Yeah. So yeah, now let's go and test it. Congratulations, you have just finished building the Ragnarok. If you have any questions regarding the Ragnarok or any other MJet design, feel free to ask in the comments below or in the official MJet Facebook group, which I will link in the description. For now, go and make your boat fly.
Oh yes!
Lepší.
Oh yes! Oh yes! Fucking úžasný!
Ty vole. Ty vole. Tak řekli, že to skoro nestíhám trackovat s tím stativem. Ty vole. Můžeme zkusit projet teďka. Jakou lineu? Yes. Dobrý.
Tak jo, ale já se podívám, teď jsem si teďka něco nepovolilo a podíváme se na ten záběr.
Okay.